Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Institute for Government Budget Day special webinar for what in the pod world is now known as a hot take on the budget. We've given ourselves a couple of hours, so maybe it's a slightly more lukewarm and considered take than that. But unlike those other hot takes available on inferior channels, we will also take your questions. So start posting away on Slido and please upvote your favorite questions because we're expecting lots and lots of questions to come in. I want to make sure that we address the issues you're most fussed about. And remember, if you're a civil servant, you can stay anonymous, particularly if you're in the Treasury and have lots and lots of questions. So who have I got on my panel? First of all, I'm Jill Rutter. I'm a senior fellow here at the Institute for Government. I'm joined by our Deputy Chief Economist, Tom Pope, Giles Wilkes, who advises everybody known to mankind about industrial strategies and former special advisor to Vince Cable, and then Theresa May. This government at the moment hasn't asked him back, but can only be a matter of time. And then Stuart Hoddinott. Stuart is a senior researcher in our public services team. So let's dig straight in. Tom, let me start with you. We've just had the OBR doing their regular post-budget press conference in our building. They've produced a new forecast. One of the questions already is going on about the sort of slightly anemic growth forecast that they seem to be producing. So what's the OBR telling us about the state of the economy?
I think the OBR forecast looks a little bit different from where it did in March, but if you sort of step back a bit on the economy, they're saying not that much change. So over the last few years, for quite a long time now, the OBR has been alongside other forecasters, fairly pessimistic about our growth prospects. This time, they think that growth will be a bit quicker in the near term, but a bit slower in the medium term. And that's actually partly a result of the government's policies. The government's doing quite a big fiscal loosening. It's borrowing more than it was previously planning to do. And that pushes up growth in the short term, but that's a kind of demand stimulus effect that fades over the medium term. So there's no big change from the OBR in its view of kind of the underlying economy, which is, I suppose, significant in itself because the government has made a big deal of trying to be a pro-growth government and trying to introduce measures that will boost growth. Perhaps we'll get onto that in a moment. And one thing that I think is quite noticeable from the forecast is the outlook for household incomes, where real household disposable income is now set to fall next year and not reach its pre-coronavirus levels until 2026-27. That's a bit worse than the projection before, and that's mainly because Rachel Reeves does think that the OBR does think that Rachel Reeves' tax measures will have an effect on household incomes, at least in the short term.
Actually, let's go to that point you were just making about the OBR not really giving the Chancellor very much credit for a budget which, we've been told by Labour that the answer to everything is growth, and yet the OBR has taken a look at her first big budget, and it was a very big budget, we'll come on to that, and said, well, not really. You don't get very much for that. If anything, you're a slight dampener on growth in the out years. Is that all bad news for Rachel Reeves?
Well, I'm sure Rachel Reeves would much have preferred that they come to a different judgment. But I think partly, it's quite a nuanced story. So that kind of net effect at the end of 5 years, which, as you say, Jill, was pretty much zero, is a combination of, they think, some negative effect from the fact that employer NICs has increased because they think that that will have some effect on the economy, some positive effect from higher investment, slightly dampened by a bit of crowding out of private sector investment, partly because they now think that interest rates will be a little bit higher than anticipated before because of the size of the fiscal loosening. But what they do then, they also do an analysis, which is something that we've called for before, and we're really pleased to see, an analysis of what you might expect the longer term effects of those investment changes to be. Because one of the challenges for any chancellor trying to introduce growth enhancing measures is most of the things that are really going to change the dial on growth aren't going to do it immediately within 1, 2 or 3 years. It's going to take longer. And when the OBR looks at that longer term view over 10 years, so as if that investment change is sustained, they think that then would be overall net positive for growth. But I suppose what this shows really is it is hard to materially change growth through policy. It's something that takes a long time. And it requires the accumulation of lots of different policies. And there are other policies that the government's pursuing that the OBR hasn't scored, but the government will hope will help. So, for example, planning reform, which is very difficult to establish what the effect might be, but the government will hope it will be positive. And on investment too, the government will hope that the investments that it goes for can have a better than average effect on the economy. What the OBR has assumed is that they've looked at past investment, the effect that tends to have on growth, and effectively said, we assume that this new investment will be averagely good compared to that previous investment. But Rachel Reeves has also introduced a set of guardrails today designed to ensure the investment she does will be good investment, better than average, and then you might see a bigger effect on economic growth.
And are those guardrails very convincing?
I sort of say that that's one bit where I've only had 2 hours and I haven't fully had a look. I mean, I think it's positive that there's the new NISTA, which is the merging of the Infrastructure and Projects Authority and the National Infrastructure Commission, that seems to play a bigger role in making decisions around infrastructure, or at least scrutinising them. There's going to be hopefully more transparency. That's one thing that we've said is really important that she committed to. And I think probably the most important thing she committed to today was that for capital budgets, they will be set for 5 years, rather than we thought originally they might only be set for 3, and they'll be updated every 2 years for departments. There will be that longer run time that departments have for planning forwards, all of which should be helpful for improving.
Okay. So I am going to let the others have a word in a second, but I just want to stay with you very briefly, Tom. You and our Chief Economist, Gemma Tetlow, have been going around the office looking slightly smug about some of the changes to the fiscal rules that the Chancellor announced. We don't seem to have PSNUFFLE, but we seem to have something that's the same, but now called net financial debt. But what's she actually done, and why do you think this is genuinely an improvement in the way in which we set fiscal rules, which we seem to do quite frequently?
That's right, much more frequently than other countries, it seems. So there are two big changes, 2 new rules that Rachel Reeves introduced today. One was a current budget balance rule. So that requires that in the 3rd year of the forecast, or at the moment in the 5th year, I'll come on to that day-to-day spending must be covered by revenues. And that meant that most of the increase in day-to-day spending that she announced today had to be funded by tax rises. But she's also changed the measure of debt that she's looking at in her debt rule. Rather than looking at public sector net debt, she's looking at public sector net financial liabilities, now newly labelled net financial debts. And that effectively accounts for more of the assets on the balance sheet rather than only looking at liabilities. And I think the big effect there really is it gives her more space to invest. That's something that clearly is part of her economic strategy. I think it's a reasonable thing to do. We don't have a strong view on whether net financial liabilities is strictly better than net debt. I think it's legitimate. But I think that the 2 ways in which this is a really big improvement in the framework. One is having the current budget balance rule. I think that's a sensible rule, and it's helpful that that's now the most binding rule on the government. She's got about 10 billion of headroom against that, about 17 billion. The other thing is that these rules will bind from a couple of years' time in the 3rd year of the forecast rather than the 5th. And that's something that we've called for previously, because the problem that we've had under the last government in particular is that rules that only apply in the 5th year are quite easy to game, because you can pencil in quite vague and unrealistic spending plans, or indeed tax plans, for the 3rd, 4th, 5th year of the forecast that might be quite non-credible. And we've seen that persistently. And I think actually this budget has unwound some of the lack of realism in certainly those public spending plans. So moving to the 3rd year should help us to have a much more sensible conversation and a much more binding set of fiscal rules that mean that the government isn't constantly penciling in unrealistic policies in the future. We're now going to have rules that align with our spending review cycles and with kind of realistic tax plans. So we think that's a really big improvement. And one final change that they've also made is that for the spring statements, where they've said they're not going to make much policy, also a good thing, big thumbs up from the Institute for Government. They've said that they're going to assess their rules based on a range of values, so whether the current budget balance is within a range rather than whether it's just less than 0. And we called previously for there to be this greater focus on ranges rather than estimates, to try to encourage chancellors, when fiscal news gets better, to allow headroom to increase rather than to constantly spend good news, as has tended to be the case in the past.
Okay, so some improvements there. There didn't seem to be as much money liberated by this change in rules as perhaps we were expecting? I mean, Tom, just very quickly before I move on to Giles, why exactly was that? People were saying that she would have £50 billion to play with, and the numbers seem much lower than that.
Yeah, so in the end, she only has headroom of about £17 billion against the public sector net financial liabilities rule, requiring that it falls as a share of GDP. And there are two main reasons why that's much lower than the types of headroom numbers people were talking about before. The most important one is that she's increased investment a lot, and that now means that net financial liabilities are increasing less than they were before, because we're investing more in physical assets that don't count as assets under that rule. The other reason, more prosaically, is that the OBR has identified an error in their calculation of public sector net financial liabilities in March, which makes a difference of around 15 or 20 billion as well. So lots of us were going around saying if she moves to a public sector net financial liabilities rule, she'll have up to 60 billion of headroom. On the last forecast, the true answer there would actually have been closer to about 40 billion.
Okay, so she didn't have as much room as she might have expected. Slightly unnerving, because that's quite a significant salient error, as we might have heard. Giles, are the markets taking fright? We know that this budget's been prepared under the spectre of the Liz Truss Kwasi Kwarteng moment. Has she got away with a big increase in borrowing, taxing and spending?
I think most of the language around market reactions to government fiscal policy is hyperbolic and silly, and owes an awful lot to people continuously quoting James Carville about where he said he'd like, if he could be reincarnated, he'd like to come back as the bond market because you can always intimidate the government. Most of the time, that is silly, over the top stuff that financial journalists need to say in order to attract some attention. The only real exception to that was what happened 2 years ago with Liz Truss, where the markets reacted violently and effectively barred the government from doing what it wanted to do. We have not seen anything like that kind of reaction. What we have seen, I think, is the sort of what you would expect to happen when a government announces that it's going to increase borrowing over the whole period. I think so much so that over 5 years out, there's going to be something like £150 billion more of public debt, slightly higher growth over that period. And as a result, you'd normally expect interest rates to be slightly higher, particularly as Tom set out earlier. They're slightly pumping the economy up in the short term. That sort of thing normally raises interest rates. So what we've seen, I think, originally, the borrowing rate on 10-year government debt, the 10-year gilt, which is the most frequently watched instrument, initially fell something like 11 or 12 basis points. That's 0.11 or 0.12 of a percentage point. And it's since then reversed that and actually risen a little bit. What's really difficult to do is you can't disentangle that from international movements. If the world's interest rates are going up, then you get that kind of effect too. The world's interest rates right now are a little bit skittish because of a certain election going on over the other side of the Atlantic. So I wouldn't say exactly nothing to see here. I would just say that it's, what you would expect to see, and nothing that really would alter a government's plans, unlike 2 years ago.
Okay, Giles, I want to come on to some of the more specific measures. Obviously, the centrepiece of this big budget on the tax side was this big hike in employers' national insurance contributions, slightly counterbalanced by an increase in this thing called the employment allowance. Anonymous has asked, is the government's ambition for economic growth threatened by the employers' national insurance increase? And then we're asked other things about, much for skills in this. What about R&D? We usually hear quite a lot about R&D support in this. So from a business point of view, how does this budget stack up?
I'll take those one by one. Number one, the OBR scored the effect of Jeremy Hunt's national insurance cuts as raising the number of people willing to work. That's what happens when you lower the tax wedge. More people are willing to work at the pre-tax wage because they're taking more home, and that has been, broadly speaking, unwound this time around. So you'd expect a small cut in employment, which has an effect on GDP. So maybe like 50,000, 100,000 people, very speculative. But all it's doing is putting our national insurance rates back to where they were a couple of years ago. It's not like it was impossible to grow when national insurance was at those levels. So that doesn't entirely undermine it. It does shift it towards a more investment-led kind of model of growth rather than a raising labour model of growth. So it's Rachel Reeves saying this is the kind of growth I want. I'm going to fund a big increase in investment with slightly higher labour taxes, and that produces a different mix. So it doesn't undermine it. As Tom implies earlier, over the 5-year period, it's basically a wash. Those two things phased differently outweigh one another. Then you asked about R&D. I believe the R&D budget has been kept where it was, which some fears were that R&D would be an easy cut. It's not something that your man in the street notices quite quickly. So R&D budgets can often be very volatile, but Rachel Reeves made great play of preserving those and the tax benefits that go towards companies doing R&D. So I don't think there's much to be seen there. You asked about skills. Well, I mean, she announced quite a large increase, I think, in Department for Education capital spending, one of the last two measures she mentioned. I'm not skilled enough to evaluate that, but you don't want, I mean, skills measures are obviously very important, but you wouldn't expect the fine details of those to be worked out and delivered by a chancellor in any case. I think DfE getting a capital budget, skills of the future, I mean, that's okay. It's not a fully worked out growth plan, but then you wouldn't expect it. But, broadly speaking, there is a growth philosophy here, which is that you need better funded public services to deliver growth. And that's more important than certain marginal tax rates. Not all of it will be recognised by the OBR, because the OBR still, although it's expanded the way it is evaluating micromeasures, it can't be fully ambitious. Some of these things the Labour Party are just betting will turn out to be good for growth, but they're not part of your standard OBR toolkit.
Now we heard
I think on that.
Yeah,
sorry,
Tom.
on that, I think it's also quite easy to say, well, Jeremy Hunt's last two budgets, they look like they increased GDP growth with their measures, but I think that doesn't recognise the kind of fiscal fiction or fiscal unreality that those plans were based on. And I think it's fair to say that what Rachel Reeves did today through that big employer national insurance increase and some of those other measures, and using that to increase spending in public services, what we now have is a much more plausible set of plans. Now, spending increases are still front-loaded, and we can get onto that. So there may still be further demands going down, but I think it's a little bit of a forced comparison almost, because that March forecast was just based on spending plans that were never going to be deliverable.
Okay, and we obviously had that review of this year's spending plans that the OBR also published. We might come on to that if we have time. Oh, we had quite a lot of sabre rattling in the run-up to the budget about the risk, people disposing of assets, people threatening to move abroad with the change in the non-dom tax regime or to avoid inheritance tax changes, etc. I mean, do we expect to see very much of this from the sort of ways in which Rachel Reeves had to shop around to top up her, if you like, her tax kitty after she'd done her big move on employers' national insurance? Tom?
I haven't yet had time to look at all of the scorecard measures. I mean, what struck me on each of those policies was what was announced did not go as far as what had been briefed, or at least potentially briefed. So on capital gains, for example, there were briefings, perhaps not from the government, but from others who were fearing it, of potentially rates going up to somewhere in the 30%. She only increased it to 24%. On inheritance tax, various suggestions that lots of money could be raised through the scrapping of reliefs. In the end, what she did was the capping of reliefs still at quite high levels. So, I mean, you inevitably do expect some behavioural response to those types of taxes because they're generally falling on more mobile people. My general impression, having not yet looked fully into the detail, is it looked like they were quite careful not to go too far and not to try to raise really large amounts of revenue from those. And that is actually what basing this tax raising on the employer NICs allowed her to do, was to raise other revenue but not have to raise enormous sums from those smaller measures, so she could do it in a slightly less distortive way.
Right. All right. Interesting. Any big surprise? I want to come on to spending, Stuart. You're being very patient. Anything that surprised you on the tax side in the budget?
I was surprised by how much they lowered the national insurance contributions threshold down to £5,000. I think we were looking at a much more modest cut. But obviously, that's a tax rise for everybody who pays it. And I was also surprised by every chancellor is addicted to raising this thing called the employment allowance, which is a sum of money you get back on your national insurance bill. It's now going to be eligible for all businesses. So it's not quite the pro SME level it was before, but it matters a lot more to small companies. And most economists would say something that's got a bigger proportional effect for small businesses. It's great for getting a cheer from the small business lobby, but it's an anti-growth measure. And I'm always amazed. That's now £10,500. It was nothing 10 years ago, and it was £5,000 or £6,000 not long ago. So I was really frankly surprised by that. I was also surprised that they seem to have foxed the Guardian into saying that there's going to be a further freeze in income tax thresholds, and they got that sort of splash to them and saying, "Oh, that's how she's making her sums that up." And then Rachel Reeves made a big play of not doing that. And I wonder whether that was connivance or just a phenomenal bait and switch from the Treasury comms team. I mean, was there anything else you had saw, Tom, that surprised
I mean, that was the big one for me, which is not that big a one, right? On the threshold. I mean, what was quite interesting, I thought, on that was that the way she talked about it in the speech almost boxed her in from future changes, in that she said that she would have considered a further increase in that freeze to be affecting working people's paychecks and therefore potentially violating either the spirit or the letter of their manifesto commitment on income tax and so on. But it was notable, I think, that how few rabbits there were in this budget, which I don't think is a bad thing. Pretty much everything I think that was announced had been briefed in some form, and there weren't that many things that had been briefed that then didn't happen to any degree, even if the extent of some of them have been slightly overplayed in briefing.
Well, I'm going to chip in that she clearly prefers working people who drive to working people who take buses to work. If you look at how she spends her money,
draft beer, those who drink
draft beer rather than those who have an Aperol Spritz or a margarita. So anyway, which maybe not what we expected from the first female chancellor, but who knows? Stuart, Rachel Reeves actually rather unusually for a budget sort of chose to end up all on spending as the big sort of centerpiece. And the very, very clear big winners were education and the NHS. What exactly did Rachel Reeves announce there? And were you surprised at the scale of the injections funding that she was prepared to countenance?
So yeah, she made quite a large spending increase in both day-to-day spending and also capital spending. On the day-to-day bit, we were looking at an increase or sort of a planned increase of about 1.2% in real terms for 2025-26. That increased to about 3.1%. So it's a large upfront injection of spending, as Tom said. The profile after that is a bit flatter. It's about 1.5% per year for the rest of the spending review period, which is also set but not allocated to departments. So that's sort of very large upfront increase. I think there's also been a shift in how she's spending money as well. Larger spending increases for capital than for day-to-day spending, which is welcome and something that we recommended in all our work, because capital has been severely underinvested in for the last 14 years and has contributed to real productivity issues in public services. In terms of how that money has been split between departments, I think the biggest thing to take away is that it's erased all the difficult choices that she might have had to make if she'd stuck to the previous spending plans. Those implied cuts for some departments such as justice, local government, which actually now have got relatively generous increases. You mentioned schools and the NHS, both of which have had increases in the day-to-day spending. I think strangely, even if she majored on those in the speech, they arguably weren't the largest increases that departments received once you looked at the numbers. The Ministry of Justice received a relatively large increase, bigger than either the NHS or schools, but I mean, off a much smaller base of spending, which is definitely welcome given the pressures in both the courts and prisons. The NHS received a large increase as well, about 3.4% in real terms for next year. But that's also very much in line with what you'd expect, given commitments on the long-term workforce plan, and also given the historical tendency to protect NHS spending at all costs. Realistically, they were protected even through austerity. So, yeah, I think it's more or less made the difficult trade-offs this year easier. I think it will make it difficult beyond 25-26 when you get those smaller overall envelope increases. Where do you then make maybe the more difficult decisions? But for 25-26, it's looking more positive for departments than they maybe expected.
So did it give us indications of what the sort of rest of the Parliament's going to look like on public spending? And a question, the top rated question, Stuart, is, to what extent was this a sort of budget that started to put some real flesh on what mission-driven government looks like?
On the first question, we got the overall envelope for the rest of this Parliament. So that's about 1.5% day-to-day spending increases for the rest of till 2028, 29, which is about in line where you'd expect given previous spending plans, but obviously off now a higher base from 25, 26 onwards. So it is a significant uplift for the rest of the Parliament. In terms of what it tells about mission-driven government and public services, I think it's still very difficult to tell from this. I mean, we've got departmental allocations, but it's hard to know exactly how that money is going to be spent still. That will be decided over the next few months by departments. I think the real test for mission-driven government is going to come at the spending review. And if you look at what we look at the health mission example, I think the real test of the health mission will be, is the DHSC willing to work with the departments on things like the wider determinants of health, on increasing prevention, those types of things, which is not really a question for this budget. It's probably going to emerge more at the spending review when departments have had a bit more time to flesh out their spending bids and to work together potentially on bids with other departments. So I think still too early to tell, disappointingly, on the mission-driven government approach.
So Tom, lots of questions coming in about what this means for local government, devolution within England, I'm afraid, to anyone watching in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Did we get any clues on actually whether the future's a bit brighter for local government? We've had a lot of councils experience at the front end of austerity, quite a lot of going bust. So ask Tom, where does he think this fits into the sort of wider devolution, their contribution to growth? And then Stuart, whether you think that, basically it's better days ahead for local government finance and funding. Tom.
Yeah, I think it's funny, you can almost split the sort of debate or discussion about devolution and local government in England in two, almost exactly the way you have there. There's sort of the exciting bit about the mayors and what they're doing, how there's going to boost growth. And then there's the sort of really difficult bit, which is local government, lots of them really struggling financially on their knees to deliver services like social care. I mean, on the former and on mayors, there was confirmation that Greater Manchester and the West Midlands will get more financial flexibility next year, what's being called an integrated settlement. So they'll get some transport, skills, housing, net zero funding in a pot for them to decide how to spend it much more flexibly. And then most of the other existing mayors, excluding a few who have had some financial impropriety accusations, we'll get that from 2026, 27 as well. So that's definitely a move towards more local autonomy for mayors to try to drive growth in some of those things. I think most of this we already knew was coming. It wasn't that new. We're waiting for a devolution white paper in the next few weeks that should flesh that out a bit more. But the really knotty one is probably a question for Stuart on local government services.
Stuart, better news for local government services?
Again, I think relative to what they were expecting, it's better news. I think, again, though, it has to be looked at in the context of where local government finance is now and where it's been since 2010. So the sort of headline is that local government will get a 3.2% increase in their core spending power in real terms for 25, 26. That's maybe much better than they expected, but also it's not really a step change in local government funding. It's more or less in line with the average settlement increases for the last 5 years since 2019. And it still leaves local government finances about 7% worse off in real terms compared to 2010. And obviously in that time, you've had a massively growing population, aging population, much more demand for social care than back then. The other thing I think to pick out of this is that Rachel Reeves made much of the national living wage increase of about 6.7%. That really affects local government finances because they employ either directly or indirectly a lot of people who are on the national living wage. Just in the adult social care sector, I did a bit of a back of the fag packet calculation before this. I think the national wage increase will cost local government about £800 million probably in next year, which wipes out the majority of their 1.3 billion grant increase that Rachel Reeves sort of announced with much fanfare. So I would say that it's welcome and it'll be better than they expected in the first place, but it's not really going to make significant inroads into stabilising the sector.
So is there any suggestion that any public services are protected from the impact of the national living wage increases? We saw some stories about carve-outs for various sectors and charities complaining about that.
I'm not sure on national wage. On the employer NICs, the government has compensated.
Employer NICs, yeah.
Yeah, on employer NICs, the government has compensated departments for the impact, or has put a line at least in the budget to offset any increase they might see. So that would be obviously to them.
So, Tom, you mentioned NISTA. We've got a question here about the new Office for Value for Money. What's that going to do? Is that a welcome change?
So the Office for Value for Money, I think it is. It's a innovation. I think we're still learning about the full details of what it will be. We had a director announced today, so that's good. It's much harder to kind of reverse ferret on these kinds of things once you've actually got a person employed and committed to it. I mean, the broad idea seems to be that it's an institution within the Treasury designed to encourage a greater consideration of value for money as they particularly deliver the spending review. I think there's never a bad thing having more people thinking about value for money, but I'm sure there are lots of Treasury spending civil servants who will say that's what they already do. I think one thing that the Office for Value for Money might be able to do to really add value is to focus on some of those cross-cutting issues that we and others have suggested could be a route to value for money, but maybe it's hard to actually deliver in a spending review. That includes a greater focus on prevention, maybe trying to increase the evidence base there and think about how the spending review can better encourage prevention, and also ensuring that capital budgets are well focused on the right things, including on maintenance. That was one really positive thing from Rachel Reeves today. We've highlighted a persistent lack of investment in public services maintenance. There was quite a big increase for maintenance in schools that she announced. So I think there are a few things it can do like that. I think how much of an impact it will have and exactly what role it will play is still a little unclear to us on the outside, at least.
Giles, we've heard a lot about sort of work in this, and in particular, I think we're promised a getting back to work or something like that white paper with some measures to tackle worklessness. And just quite interested, this is sort of first budget of a Labour government. We know that they're under pressure on things like the 2-child limit from their backbenchers, etc. Did this strike you as a budget that had a sort of big story about tackling worklessness from an economic point of view, or indeed inequality more generally, the sort of thing you might expect to see as a big differentiator between a Labour budget and a Conservative budget?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of moving parts to this. Rachel Reeves, I think at one point talked about how she will be ushering in an integrated approach to the problem of worklessness. In other words, it's not just about being tough and mean on the welfare side and people no longer wanting to sit at home on their sofas. So there's reform in the DWP side. There's also health measures, but at the same time, Conservative commentators will naturally point out that she's damaged slightly the work incentives. There's no getting away from that. But if you're a largish company for whom the employment allowance doesn't matter much, you're paying a lot of that £25 billion raised through national insurance. And that is hitting you in terms of your ability to afford workers. And if you're employing lower income workers, the national living wage going up so fast, in particular for 18 to 24-year-olds, where it'll be rising up by 16%, all of these are going to damage the incentive to hire. Now, it might mean that those people go off to education instead, and maybe you could argue that this is all part of a new vision for the labour market, which is we should be prioritising higher value work, raising the national minimum wage as part of that, improving training and so forth is going to be another part. But there's a lot of moving parts to this. Some of it is coming in reforms that have been scored. In other words, they're assuming that they're going to be able to get people off the unemployed rolls. But it's I think you've got to say details to follow at this stage right now. And some of the things that are really scored are clearly, objectively, not great for hiring incentives.
And Tom, we saw bits in the OBR assessment. They've obviously set out some of their sort of risks on both the financial and the economic policy side. We've already seen them scoring some things like a mild uptick in inflation as employers pass on some of the costs that Giles was mentioning, a mild increase in debt financing costs and stuff like that. What does Rachel Reeves need to be very careful of in the sort of weeks, months, years that she'll hope to be Chancellor?
Yeah, I think as Giles said, that those were the kinds of changes that you might expect to be associated with this kind of package. But you also think that you can do this once and tell a story of why you're doing it, and both the public and markets may well sort of accept that and move on. I think the key thing now is that that she's got a fiscal strategy that she can stick to over the Parliament. That would ideally mean she'll be hoping that she doesn't need to come back and do more tax rises, having done such a big tax rise at the start of the Parliament, hoping that the spending plans will be sufficient such that we all long for days when budgets could be more boring. And in a way, she's done something so big today that there's a chance that will happen. But I think the big risk is probably that the headroom she has against her fiscal rules is actually still pretty small. So even though she did move to net financial debt, she used up quite a lot of the headroom there. She was given a bit more headroom against the current budget balance rule relative to March, but she spent some of that. So she's really dealing with headroom of about 10 billion on one of the rules, 15, 16 billion on the other, the kinds of things that a further downgrade to growth, whether that be for anything that's UK specific or global, could sort of blow that off course. And then the increases in spending beyond next year don't look that big, albeit that there's very big increases this year and next. So to me, that's the big risk, because I think she's made a very big play since becoming Chancellor of the importance of stability. And I think ideally what she's trying to do with this budget is provide a direction and some stability. But I see some risks there if things go wrong. Actually, there's not as much of a margin or a buffer as you might ideally like if you're planning for this to be your approach that covers the whole Parliament.
Okay, I just want to we're going to end more or less on time, she said. Slightly overshoot my forecast, but we believe in ranges now, as Tom was saying. This has been billed as the big reset moment for the government, and we've had the sort of pitch with the heavy roller on it for quite a few weeks now. Quick reactions from all of you to two questions. First, does the government now appear to have a coherent narrative about what this government is really about, that marks it? Will all those things that said there's been a bit of a vacuum since July the 4th, have they answered most of those questions now? And secondly, when he responded, Rishi Sunak, in his final outing from the dispatch box, said, actually, we've seen this is just a litany of broken promises, everything up, exactly what we told you would happen if you elected a Labour government, and you've further undermined people's trust in politics. Do you think that's a fair accusation? Stuart, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I'll start with the first bit, maybe sort of leave
the second one.
Yeah, and I'll stick to public services as well, mostly. I think first of all, it was very good to get recognition from the government that public services in a very bad way, and also that investment in public services has wider economic benefits. I think that's been missing from a lot of the narrative in recent years. This next financial year, 25-26, is a genuine change in the approach from recent years. It's large increases in day-to-day spending and capital spending, more importantly, compared to recent settlements. I think that's really good to see. I do think it's maybe still punted a lot of the questions into the spending review. There's still implied quite difficult choices to make beyond 25-26. I think also the government's public service reform programme is still very vague to me, and it wasn't really illuminated that much in this budget. Rachel Reeves talked about prevention and moving care of hospitals in the NHS, but how they're going to do that is still very unclear, and partly because they're still doing reviews and they're still in the process of consulting on a 10-year plan for the NHS, and I think maybe they're still a bit unclear on what they want to do. So I think there's a lot still to answer in terms of public service reform and where they want to go with public service spending in the future.
Tom, are we now clear what sort of government we've got?
I think in some ways we are. You know, it's very clearly a very different fiscal approach to the one laid out in March. This is big day-to-day spending, big investment spending, bigger tax, bigger borrowing. That's a pretty major change. I'm not sure we yet have that full strategy. I think what I would say is the government now has a set of fiscal plans that can be consistent with a plan that delivers on their manifesto and delivers the promises and the narrative they've talked about. They've talked about wanting a decade of national renewal. I think the spending review next year will be really important for fleshing out exactly what that means. But they now have a set of fiscal numbers that could plausibly deliver on that, where I think before they simply didn't. And I suppose that links into your second question on trust. And you know, we and others said before the election, these spending plans that both main parties are implicitly or explicitly committed to are not going to be deliverable. And after the election, they won't deliver on them and they will increase taxes. And that has happened. And I think it would be a much healthier political conversation, economic conversation, if governments could admit these things in elections and be honest about them. It is very much a kind of stain on both houses issue, and I don't need to try and get elected. And so I understand that I talk to people who are more politically inclined and they just think I'm hopelessly naive for thinking that parties should be open about the types of tax increases they want to deliver. And it did seem from polling at the last election that most people thought that taxes were going to go up, even though both parties were saying they weren't going to and would go up slightly more with Labour. But yeah, I don't think it's great for trust in politics that only 3 months after a manifesto that promised only very small fiscal changes, that we have actually those very big changes. That the manifesto was not that different really from the March plan, and this is a complete sea change.
And Giles, final word.
Yes, you asked whether is there a distinctive shape coming out of this government and has it done something to trust? I think, number one, definitely, this is a very Labour budget. And it has done what most people expect when you elect a Labour government, which is they increase borrowing a little bit, they increase taxes by a fair amount, they spend it on investment, they spend it on spending, they prioritise public services, and they are less obsessed with the marginal effects of taxes than Conservatives are. That is exactly what we expect from the whole thing. Throw in a whole bunch of, blaming the last lot for fibbing about the in-year spending pressures, and that's the complete package. So I do think there is a shape there. They are making a bet that the investments they're able to make with this are going to outweigh the other effects, and that is the major problem for the country. And by repeating the word investment 3 times, many times in her speeches, Reeves has always been really clear that that's what she thinks. So it's absolutely a new direction. And I'm a bit disappointed that they haven't done more of the IFG things, the tax reform, not going after really bad taxes like stamp duty, continuing to roll forward the fuel duty freeze, for goodness sake, and various other things like that. But, turns out she's a politician too. And on the matter of the trust thing, I mean, the immediate post-budget interview with Darren Jones that I saw on the BBC, it was pretty uncomfortable. I mean, Paul Johnson, soon to be ex of the IFS, was really quite clear. They said, you said you're not going to raise NICs and you're raising them. I mean, it's really awkward because we all know that whatever the actual truth of the in-year black hole, and I think we all need to read that 40-page document and look at 160 measures of unfunded pressures that the Treasury say are there. We all knew that the year 2029 wasn't well funded, and that's where we really need to raise money. And as Tom says, they weren't able to be honest about that in the elections. So I think that's just something they've had to wear, which means if it really needs to deliver, or people say it was dishonesty for what. But yeah, I think it's definitely a new direction. And, I, for one, it's good to have a new direction, I guess, given which way we were heading.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether replacing prudence for a purpose with dishonesty for a purpose is quite the slogan that you'd want to characterize a new chancellor by. But anyway, no, I think it's quite interesting, and that Rachel Reeves decided to bite the bullet now and get all these sort of, if you like, get the sort of numbers aligned in the way that Tom was saying. I'm going to draw it to a close there. I'm going to thank my excellent panel, Stuart, Giles and Tom, who can go now back to writing screeds of comments on the budget. Do watch out for that. There'll be loads more forthcoming from the Institute for Government over the coming weekdays, and indeed tonight probably looks at Tom, who's got to go back to a hot keyboard as we speak. We will be hosting this as a podcast, so do recommend it to all your friends and listen in, and do watch out for more IFG content. And indeed, next week, we're returning immediately to the subject of prevention, which is clearly one of the government's new big themes. And then the week later, I think on the 12th of November, we have a very big conference on the future of public services, which, as Stuart said, we know a bit more about now, but we don't have the full picture. So do tune into that as well. And thank you all very much for listening.